Welcome to Wonderful Things in Romans. Psalm 119:18 says, "Open my eyes that I may see wonderful things in your law." Join me in my search for the wonderful things in St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. I'm Brian Campbell, and I spent 10 years studying the book of Romans, both by translating from the original Greek and by studying the commentaries, lexicons, and other resources available to me. If you've not subscribed to this channel, do that down below and ring the bell for the alerts. Don't forget to click the thumbs up button to tell me that you liked this video. And now for the lesson. Romans chapter 16. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchrea. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Greet also the church that meets at their house. Greet my friend Epaenetus, who was the first convert to Christ in the province of Asia. Greet Mary, who worked very hard for you. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. Greet Ampliatus, my dear friend in the Lord. Greet Urbanus, our co-worker in Christ, and my dear friend Stachys. Greet Apelles, whose fidelity to Christ has stood the test. Greet those who belong to the household of Aristobulus. So this is Roman study number 41. Paul begins to close this letter, like he does most of his other letters, by mentioning others known to him, either in the church at that location, or which are very likely to come there. So he starts off, and I've already read to you the New International Version, but most of the quotes from here on will be from my own translation. So he starts off by saying, I recommend to you as a friend our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea, in order that you may receive her in the Lord, worthily of the holy saints, and to help her in whatever she may need of you, for she also herself has mentored many, and myself also. So Phoebe is from the church at Cenchrea. It's just to the east of Corinth, which is why many theologians think that Romans was written from Corinth. She is recorded as a servant of the church. It uses a word to describe her service which would eventually become the word deacon, and it's in the feminine tense, so that would be deaconess. What being a deaconess meant in a male-dominated first century Greco-Roman Cenchrea, I don't know. I think it can only be guessed at. I think that she held some sort of recognized position in the church, probably serving at least the women in the church. Paul tells the Roman church to accept Phoebe in a godly manner as befits those who are saints or those who are holy. They're to provide her with whatever help she may need. The original Greek here hints that her trip to Rome involves something of importance. I think she may have been part of a group going to Rome to carry this letter. Paul describes Phoebe as the patroness of many, including himself, and he uses that word. In a formal legal sense in that day and age, a woman could not act as a patron. The Roman patron was a head of household who would take in and support others, such as philosophers, poets, or artists, but Paul describes her as a female patron. I chose to translate this as mentor to capture the sense of it for a modern mind. The next two people in verse 3 that he mentions are Prisca and Aquila, or Priscilla and Aquila. The Greek is Prisca. And he calls them my fellow workers in Christ Jesus who wagered their own necks on my behalf. That's an interesting phrase. To whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks. Paul wants the Romans to welcome or give their own greetings to Prisca and Aquila. These are very likely the same people mentioned in several other places in the New Testament. So for that, you can look at Acts chapter 18, verses 2, 18, and verse 26. You can look at 2 Timothy 4:19. You can look at 1 Corinthians 16:19. Paul describes them to the Romans as fellow workers in Christ Jesus. That simply means they were also engaged in ministry. Apparently, Prisca and Aquila had done something for Paul that saved his life, putting their own lives in jeopardy. Leon Morris says that this was widely known among the Gentile churches. And apparently, because Paul never explains it, he just says, hey, this is what they did. Never explains it. So the assumption is people knew what he was talking about. The text says that all these churches gave thanks for the couple's actions. We don't know what they did. I'm sure it was a great story. But it was so widely known, nobody thought to write it down. Paul ends his greeting to Prisca and Aquila by mentioning that he wants to greet the church that is in their house. House churches were the seeds of Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Dedicated church buildings don't seem to have come into being until the 3rd century. The Wikipedia article on church buildings places the earliest church known as no earlier than AD 233, a third of the way into the 3rd century. The next person Paul mentions is Epaenetus, whom he calls my beloved. This may be the fatherly affection felt for one personally introduced to Christ. He is called in the present tense the first fruits of Asia for Christ. He's not simply the first convert, as some translations put it. That doesn't convey the sense of it, especially coming from someone of Paul's Jewish background. The word first fruits has a very specific meaning in both the tithing and sacrificial systems. The first fruits were what you would set aside out of the very first things harvest that were dedicated to God. You paid your part to God first, and then you took what was left. So I think that to say that someone is the first fruits of Christ in Asia is to show faith that the harvest is going to continue. The first fruits imply something coming after. This is first, then we've got other stuff, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, whatever. Epaenetus, however you say his name, was just the first of many. Verse 6, he says, to greet Mary, who has done much for you. Mary was probably a Jewish woman, because it's a Jewish name. So she's now living in Rome, and she may very well have been a slave. Only God knows just how much she did for the Roman church. But apparently Paul had heard of her efforts, and he greeted her directly. She was important. But 2,000 years later, we don't know what she did. Another story that's going to have to wait till heaven. In verse 7, he says, greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and fellow prisoners, who are noteworthy among the apostles and who were in Christ before me. So Andronicus means a man of victory. Junia may have been his wife. Certainly they're associated together in people's thoughts, or they would not have been addressed together. So Paul calling them kinsmen, as well as certain other people later, probably implies that they were Jews. Some commentators think that they may have literally been his kinsmen, members of his extended family. So it would be like me sending greetings to all of my aunts and uncles and cousins, and my brother and my sister and my nephew and my nieces, and greeting each of them by name. Maybe that's what Paul's doing, but I think we can really only safely assume that they were Jewish. He calls them fellow prisoners, so they apparently had gone to great lengths to spread the gospel. Paul says that they were Christians before he was. So the crucifixion is usually dated about AD 29 to 33. For various reasons, I lean towards 29. Paul's conversion is usually dated to about AD 34, within 2 years of the cross, no matter when it was. So that makes Andronicus and Junia, if they were saved before Paul, very early Christians indeed. It would imply that they may have started somewhere near Jerusalem. So in verse 8, he greets Ampliatus. He says, "Whom I love in the Lord." It's another beloved brother in Christ. Leon Morris says that Lightfoot says that the name was common for slaves in Caesar's household. I have to trust the sources. I don't know. He says in verse 9, "Greet Urbanus, our co-worker in Christ, and Stachys, whom I love." Urbanus was another common name among slaves, and the name Stachys means an ear of grain, so another worker name. Paul calls him beloved, or who I love, may indicate that those people whom he's calling this are his personal friends. Verse 10 is interesting. "Greet Apelles, who is tested and approved in Christ." Chapter 1, verse 28, Paul refers to a reprobate or a debased mind. That word for debased or reprobate is the opposite of this word for approved. They're antonyms. The word implies that something has been compared to a set standard, and it has been found to meet that standard. So it could be translated, tested and approved in Christ. Whatever test Apelles faced in his life, he passed that test and is now approved in Christ. It's another story that nobody wrote down. So from now until heaven, we have to wonder. But my prayer for myself and for everyone who watches is that we may also pass our test of faith and be approved in Christ. Thank you for joining me for Wonderful Things. Please leave a comment down below to tell me what you like or don't like about this video. Tell me what I ought to change or what I ought to keep doing. Click the thumbs up button down below or subscribe if you haven't already. Help this channel grow by telling others. Finally, please pray for me as I work on future videos. I'm Brian Campbell. May God richly bless you.